Well, if you have a Bible, I've got two places for you this morning. We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and Proverbs chapter 9. We are going to start in Proverbs 9, and then we're going to finish in Ecclesiastes 7. So turn to Proverbs 9 and then stick a finger or a bookmark or a piece of gum in Ecclesiastes 7. Ecclesiastes and Proverbs are both part of a section of the Old Testament known as wisdom literature. It comprises right there in the middle of your Bible, the wisdom books, and they deal with some of the biggest questions that people ask about life with God. For the last couple of months, we've been looking at Ecclesiastes, and we've learned so far that it was written by a man named Kohelet. That's his Hebrew name. He calls himself Kohelet, which literally means the preacher or the teacher. And he's writing at the end of his life as an old man, and his epistle has a tragic, remorseful, repentant tone to it. Kohelet was a very successful man. He was wealthy. He had accumulated a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and experience. He had a very active and busy love life. He was very good at his work, and yet at the end of his life, he was unfulfilled, bitter, and jaded. And so he wrote this book, Ecclesiastes, to say, what can you learn from my tragically successful situation? And one of the keys to understanding Ecclesiastes is to see that it was written in conversation with other wisdom literature and other wisdom books. And in particular, it was written in conversation with Proverbs. Proverbs was the heart of Israel's wisdom tradition, and it was compiled well before Kohelet wrote Ecclesiastes. So by the time the preacher penned Ecclesiastes, Proverbs was well known in Israel. Many young men growing up would have memorized sections, if not the whole book of Proverbs. And so Ecclesiastes assumes that you know the background of Proverbs and wants to dialogue with it. Now that's important today because we're going to look at, in a few minutes, the end of Ecclesiastes 7, the second half of Ecclesiastes 7. And he's going to assume that you know the Proverbs background. In fact, he's going to bounce off of and echo and dialogue and even argue a little bit with Proverbs. So we need to know the background in Proverbs, and it goes something like this. Proverbs was written for young people to teach them wisdom. Wisdom literally just means skill in living. It's knowing how to navigate life well. It's knowing how to speak and how to act in different circumstances and situations. And wisdom acknowledges that we are sinful and the world is broken, and therefore life is complicated by our sinfulness and the brokenness of the world introduced by our sin. And so life is not always easy to navigate. Relationships are not always easy to navigate. Decisions are not always clear what you should do, who to date, who to marry, what kind of person to partner with, how to make a friend, how to keep a friend, how to reconcile with a friend. Someone wants to argue with you. Do you argue with them or do you move on? These are the kinds of questions that Proverbs deals with, how to live skillfully in a broken, fragmented world where you yourself are also broken and fragmented. This is wisdom. And wisdom in Proverbs has many companions, one of which is called righteousness. And righteousness is just wisdom with an ethical dimension to it. So righteousness is knowing and doing what is good and just and virtuous. So this is one of wisdom's many companions in the book of Proverbs. And wisdom also has rivals in the book of Proverbs. And her chief rival is called folly or foolishness. And if wisdom navigates her way skillfully through life, folly bungles her way through life, shooting herself in the foot a lot. If wisdom hangs out with righteousness, folly hangs out with wickedness and evil. And these two paths, wisdom and folly, are competing for the affections of young people in the book of Proverbs, competing for the affections of people whom Proverbs often calls simple, meaning they're not yet wise, but they're also not fools. They're just young and simple and still setting the course and the direction of their life. They're somewhere in a process. And Proverbs is going to personify, that's a poetic device where you make something that's not a person sound like a person. Proverbs is going to personify wisdom and folly as two voluptuous women competing for the affection of a young man. Now, any of you ever been to high school? You know how this works. Have you ever seen two girls interested in the same guy at once. I got to see this in high school, never as the one in the middle, but always as an outside observer. Never had the pleasure of being caught in this vicious tug of war. Oh, let me be caught in the tug of war. Well, I was never caught in the tug of war, but I watched girls compete for the quarterback, and you know how it goes. Each one's primping and flirting and doing her best to get his attention. Well, that's the picture in Proverbs. Look at that first passage I had you turn to, Proverbs chapter 9. Just begin reading the first part of it with me. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. Wisdom is a lady, a beautiful lady who has built a home. She's built her house. She's hewn her 7 pillars. She's prepared a feast. She's slaughtered her beast. She has mixed her wine. She set her table. And now she is calling to the young, simple men, come, eat of my bread, drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live. Well, this is wisdom in the book of Proverbs. But there's another lady on the prowl. Look down at verse 13. The woman folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by who are going straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there and that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. So we got 2 ladies both competing for the same simple people. They both have a house. They've both prepared a meal. They're both calling from the highest places in the town. And the question is, which one of these is going to win? And Proverbs urges us to choose wisdom and to dine with her and to marry that girl. And your life will go well. In fact, there is a promise attached to wisdom all throughout the book of Proverbs, and there's a warning attached to folly. Listen again. Look at verse 6. Leave your simple ways and live. Wisdom promises life. Look down in verse 11. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years will be added to your life. Wisdom promises a long life, a long, satisfied life to those who marry her. Well, folly has a warning attached to her. He does not know that the dead are there. Her guests are in the depths of Sheol. That's the place of the dead. Folly promises a difficult life, and you will die young. That's the message of Proverbs. Now, that's not just Proverbs 9. Let me show you a few other places that this theme comes out in the book of Proverbs. Look with me, for example, at Proverbs chapter 3. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding, for the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. Here's another one from Proverbs chapter 4. Hear, my son, and accept my words, that the years of your life may be many. I have taught you the way of wisdom. I have led you in the path of uprightness. When you walk, your steps will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. Wisdom promises a long life. Look one more time at Proverbs chapter 14. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. So the promises of wisdom, your days will be multiplied. Years will be added to your life. Long life is in her right hand. The years of your life may be many. that one may turn away from the snares of death. This is the theology of Proverbs. This is the message and the promise. Wisdom leads to life, folly leads to death. This is why our pop stars all die young. Wise men live long, fools die young. That's the message of Proverbs. And in Ecclesiastes 7, which we're going to look at today, Kohelet wants to argue a little bit with Proverbs. Now, he's not going to refute it outright. He's not going to contradict it outright. We'll see in just a minute that he still buys into this general principle that Proverbs has been teaching. But he wants to stick an asterisk on it in Ecclesiastes 7. You know how an asterisk works, right? It's an exception or a qualification or a footnote or a yeah, but that you need to take note of. So, Barry Bonds is the all-time home run leader in baseball, asterisk. He hit half of those home runs with his head and his torso swollen to 3 times their normal size due to steroid use. There's an exception, a footnote that needs to be noted. Well, Ecclesiastes 7 verses 15 and following are an asterisk on Proverbs. It's going to be a qualification to what we just heard. And Kohelet's point is going to be this. It's a qualification that religious, church-going, rule-obeying, Bible-reading, well-put-together, moderately successful people need to hear. He's going to say Proverbs is right. Folly generally leads to death, wisdom to life. But, asterisk, that principle can be misunderstood and abused. And to be truly wise, you can't just know the big principle. You've also got to read the footnote. Ecclesiastes 7. Pick it up in verse 15. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Proverbs. Righteous people, wise people live long. Wicked people, foolish people die young. Ecclesiastes 7:15. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. There's a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Asterisk. Kohelet wants you to see that the principle that is taught in Proverbs is generally true, but not always 100% of the time foolproof true. So, something is generally true if it's usually the case, more often than not as a rule of thumb. Generally, February is cold in Colorado. Asterisk. We do sometimes have some Indian summer days when the patios at all the restaurants are open. Generally, wisdom leads to a long life. Asterisk, sometimes righteous men perish in their righteousness. Sometimes wicked men prolong their life in evil doing. And in the verses that follow, Kohelet is going to show us the danger in not noticing this asterisk. There's a danger, he's going to say, in confusing the general promises of wisdom with an airtight, foolproof, infallible, never let you down, remove all risk from life equation. That's going to be the message. Pick it up in verse 16. Be not overly righteous and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. So he's got some advice on how to live in light of the general principle, and the asterisk. And embedded in this advice is going to be a warning to religious people. So notice a couple of things here. First, notice in verse 17 that Kohelet still believes and he still buys into the general principle of Proverbs. So, verse 17, be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? Foolishness, wickedness will probably kill you young. That's just a restatement of the argument of Proverbs. So, he still buys into this general principle. But, second thing to notice, in verse 16, he is going to say there's a danger in making that general principle into an airtight law. That's the undercurrent. Be not overly righteous. Do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? That will also destroy you. That's another kind of foolishness. Now, the key to this whole passage is, what does he mean by overly righteous and too wise? And what does it mean to be overly righteous? What would it look like if you were overly righteous? What would it look like if you were too wise? That's the key to understanding this whole passage. Now, it sounds at first that he might be saying something like this: sin a little bit. You need a nice middle ground of respectable morality. So be generally good, but don't take this Christianity thing too seriously. And if that's what he's saying, many of us are like, well, hey, I can do that, right? Remember that song? If you want to get to heaven, you got to raise a little hell. Who sang that? That was the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. Now, is Kohelet an Ozark Mountain daredevil? Is that what he's saying? Well, I don't think that's going to work in the context of this passage. Sorry to burst your fun, but here's what he says in verse 18. He calls the person who is not overly righteous and not too wise, he calls them one who fears God. Now, fears God is the general explanation throughout the Old Testament of what a proper response to God is. It means to reverence him, to respect him. Fears God is never a casual, lukewarm, mediocre kind of devotion. It's what God calls for in faith. So I don't think that Kohelet is advocating some middle ground religiosity. I don't think he could describe it as one who fears God if that's what he was advocating. I think a better way to understand what does it look like to be overly righteous, what does it look like to make yourself too wise, a better way to understand that is going to be a way that's consistent with what he said in verse 15. So what did he say in verse 15? He said that living righteously and living wisely doesn't 100% insulate you from all the problems of life in a fallen world. He said in general it helps, but sometimes, asterisk, it doesn't help. Life is more complicated than karma. You can't reduce life to a simplistic, good things happen to good people and bad things always happen to bad people platitude. It's more complicated than that. So the person who is overly righteous is someone who thinks that they can attain a level of goodness or righteousness that will automatically, all the time, insulate them from the problems of life in a broken, fallen world. And the person who is too wise thinks that they can understand with certainty why everything happens and how it all fits together. Any of you ever read the book of Job, another of the wisdom books? Here's the situation in Job. Job is called the most righteous man alive at the time. God says, I have no servant like Job. Job is a good man. He is upright, upstanding. He is wealthy and successful, and he shares all that God has given him with his neighbors and the poor. He's a good father. He has a big family. He's the uber man in the Old Testament. And God lets all of that stuff be taken away from him and strips him naked, leaves him with boils on his skin, naked, trying to scratch his itches. And as Job is in the pit of despair, his friends come to him and they say, Job, we know why this is happening to you. You've done something wrong, and God he's getting you back. They've got karma at the heart of their theology. And we know, because we can read the whole book, we know that's not at all what was happening. See, his friends were too wise. They thought they knew why it was happening. And they said, Job, you need to be better. You need to be more righteous than you already are. Well, this is the kind of thing that Kohelet is warning us against. Skip down to verse 23 and following, and look at how he describes his quest for wisdom and righteousness. He says, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. You guys know what a scheme is? It's a big, ordered, systematic, overarching plan. Big scheme. It's how everything that happens fits together into some larger picture. A few weeks ago, we studied Ecclesiastes 3. And in Ecclesiastes 3, Kohelet described many of the polarities of life. He said there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. He didn't say that last part. The birds added that. But in saying this, he meant there's an appointed time. There's a time that's been set, that's been fixed by God, a season for everything that happens under the sun. Then he went on to say, God has made everything beautiful in its time. And we learned that that means that everything has a place. Everything fits into a bigger plan. And each thing by itself may not be beautiful, but on the whole, it is. Each thing has a place in the plan and a bigger scheme. He said also God has put eternity into man's heart, meaning we have a sense that there's this bigger plan, this bigger scheme. We even want to know it yet, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We can't know the plan. We can't know the scheme yet. Well, he's saying the same thing in Ecclesiastes 7. I turned to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things. It was too far from me. I couldn't find it. It was deep, very deep. Who can find it out? No one. That's his answer. So this is what it looks like to be too wise. He's given you a picture. It's trying to know things that you can't know. It's claiming to know things that you can't claim to know. And notice what it does. It goes beyond what God has revealed to us and told us. God has told us many things. He hasn't told us everything. Now, many of you are in no danger yet of exhausting everything that God has told us. I often hear people arguing against theology. Don't do theology. Mystery, mystery, mystery. That's fine if you do theology. Many of you don't do theology. So that's usually an argument of people who haven't learned anything. But there is another side of this coin here. There are some things that God hasn't told us. In particular, he hasn't told us how every event that happens under the sun, every event that happens in our lives fits into a bigger plan. And when you try to be too wise, you think you can know how it fits, even though you can't really know how it fits. You have to go beyond what God has told you. So that's what it looks like to make yourself too wise. Now, what would it be then to make yourself overly righteous? It usually means that you try to attain to a level of goodness, a level of righteousness that will insulate you from the problems of the world by creating a system of do's and don'ts and structures and laws that usually goes beyond what God has told us and commanded us to do. Both of these are attempts to break beyond the limitations of living in a fallen world. We think if I could just be good enough, live wisely enough, I could be safe. If I could just learn enough, I could understand why. Now, this is a frequent problem in religious communities. A common struggle of religious folks is, I did everything right How could God let this happen to me? And Kohelet says, that starts by taking something good, God's revelation and his wisdom, but then using it in a way that he didn't intend. So God has given us wisdom to navigate the quirkiness of life. Therefore, is it possible to live a pain-free life? No. He hasn't given it for that reason. God has given us revelation of his plans and his purposes and his promises. Therefore, is it possible to know why everything happens? No. He hasn't given it for that reason. Can wisdom help you navigate life? Yes. Can it give you a pain-free existence? No. Can righteousness help you navigate life? Yes. Can you be perfectly righteous? No. Who were the people that were most bothered by Jesus? The one righteous man who's ever lived. They were the Pharisees. And what had the Pharisees done? They had constructed a law on top of the law. They had taken God's law and said, we got to keep God's law perfectly so that he will have to visit us and bless us and restore our nation. So they created 613 more laws on top of the laws so they would have laws on how to keep the laws. They were very righteous, very, very, very righteous. What was their problem with Jesus? He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He's not as righteous as we are. He has too much fun. Well, in verse 19 and following, Kohelet's going to tease this out some more. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Now, this is just a straightforward traditional proverb talking about the goodness of wisdom. You could also translate it like this: wisdom makes a wise man stronger than 10 rulers who are in a city. In other words, wisdom is better than political power. Better to be a simple, middle class, working class, blue collar, wise person than to be mayor or governor. Better to be a wise carpenter than king of the whole empire. Wisdom is good, but verse 20, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Remember, even the wisest, most righteous among us is still sinful. Verse 21, do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows many times that you have yourself cursed others. Your servant in that day was the person who was closest to you. They were with you everywhere you went. They saw you in every circumstance of life. They knew you better and what you did better than anyone who ever existed. I knew a guy in college, lived around the corner from me in the fraternity house, a couple of years older than me. After he graduated, he became what they called the body man to the President of the United States of America. He went everywhere with him, went to every meeting, carried the briefcase and the mints and the gum and the pens and the briefs and the change of clothes and the change of ties to every meeting, went on every flight. He has stories to tell. He saw things that most people don't see. If you listen, Kohelet says, to everything your servant says, you'll probably hear your servant cursing you because he knows your faults. He knows your shortcomings. And in fact, you yourself know that many times you've cursed others. So don't take yourself too seriously. That's what he's saying. And finally, in verse 23 and following, he's going to describe for us his quest and how he discovered these limitations of wisdom and righteousness. He's going to be looking for two things. He's looking for the scheme of things, which we already know what that means. And he's looking to find a righteous person. Let's see how it goes. All this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? I turn my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. I don't find that. But, verse 26, I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets and whose hands are fetters. Who is he describing here? He is describing Madame Folly, the lady we just read about in Proverbs chapter 9. He says, in my quest to know everything, in thinking that I could attain some superior kind of knowledge and insight, you know who I really found? I found foolishness. I got trapped in the wrong house. I found the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. There's another way to be foolish. It's not the way we typically imagine, but he just described it for us. What about a righteous person? Can you find a righteous person? Verse 27, behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. Just in case you didn't get the message. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So did you find a righteous person? Well, one man among 1,000, but I didn't find a woman. Anyone want to take a guess at what that means? Me neither. Some say this is the musings of an angry old sexist. I don't know if that's what he's saying. I don't know that the emphasis is on gender. In fact, the word translated man is a Hebrew word that can mean male, or it can just mean person. But he says, of 1,000 people, I found one person who might be righteous. Here's what I really found. Here's what I can be really sure of. This is the only thing I can be sure of. God has made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. In other words, all I've confirmed is that we are sinful. So he hasn't gone any further than traditional wisdom could have taken him. And so we are sinful, and we have to trust God. We cannot escape through wisdom and righteousness the vicissitudes of life in a fallen world. Well, he got to the end of his journey and he said, I better write a book. I'll call it Ecclesiastes. And I'm going to tell those kids who've been reading Proverbs, now this is good. It's going to help you navigate life. It's not going to insulate you from every problem. It will help you know how life works, won't teach you the whole scheme of things. You still live in a fallen and confusing world. You're still a sinful person. You're going to have to trust God. Well, it turns out that the difference between being overly wise and overly righteous and not, it's not just the difference between being a fool and wise. It's also the difference between receiving and rejecting the gospel of Jesus. This principle showed up again when Jesus, the perfect righteous man, the one righteous man, when Jesus showed up. And when Jesus showed up, he came first to his people, Israel, his kinsmen, and many of them believed in him, but many of them, they didn't think they needed him. He didn't look wise enough or righteous enough for them. They rejected him. They rejected the one good, righteous, perfect man who's ever lived. They even said, we've never seen anything like this. And then they said, nah, we don't want that. Here's the Apostle Paul reflecting on how that happened in Romans chapter 10. He says, referring to his Jewish kinsmen, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Could also be translated wisdom. They have a zeal for God, but not according to wisdom. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Here's the real pitfall of thinking you can be overly righteous, super righteous, really righteous. You don't see your need for Jesus. Well, as the message of Jesus spread throughout the Greco-Roman world, many of the Gentiles, sometimes called Greeks, many of them came to faith in Jesus. But many of them heard the message and rejected it. To them, the idea that God would send his son to live among us and would die on a cross to atone for our sin and would be raised from the dead on the third day, that all sounded foolish to them. Here's the Apostle Paul reflecting on why they rejected Jesus. This from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, whom God made our wisdom and our righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So the real tragedy in making yourself overly righteous and too wise is that when the one righteous man shows up, you think he's a fool. And when the one incarnate wisdom of God shows up, you think it's foolishness. And so if you look at the gospel of Jesus and you scoff at it, you are overly righteous and too wise. Now, this is not just a problem for people before they become Christians. This is a problem for ongoing life with Christ, because there's an ongoing temptation, even among people who go, yeah, I believe in Jesus, there's an ongoing temptation to think we need something else in addition to him. Much of your New Testament was written to refute a teaching that came early into the life of the Jesus movement that taught, typically by devout Jewish people, devout Jewish Pharisees who had believed that Jesus was the Son of God raised from the dead. And they taught, that's good. Jesus is good. We believe that. That's good stuff. That's good wisdom. We're also going to need to keep the law of Moses. So they tried to add a righteousness on top of the righteousness God had already provided. And Paul wrote letters like Galatians and Colossians to beg early Christians not to buy into this system because it would weigh you down. As the Jesus movement spread for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, gradually people said, we're not as good as we should be. We need to be more righteous so God will bless us. And this whole ascetic movement was born, where people moved to the desert and fasted, extravagantly and went off the grid for Jesus. It was a heavy system, hard. Just striving to earn God's blessing. Finally, one of these monks, his name was Martin Luther, he woke up and said, "This is insanity. It is weighing me down. It is driving me crazy. It's making me so insecure. I do all this stuff, and I'm still not sure I'm in good standing with God. And he opened his Bible again. He read Galatians. He read Romans. He read about a righteousness of God that's not of our own, but it's a gift, and it comes from Jesus alone. He said, all I have to do is trust Jesus. And his soul was set free. That's how we got the Protestant Reformation. And so, ultimately, the wisdom of Kohelet and Ecclesiastes doesn't just help us navigate life well. It helps us to keep our eyes on and to see and to appreciate, to love and to cling to the gospel of Jesus and be freed from silly, hyper-spiritual, extra-biblical, uptight, fearful religiosity. We've got something much better, a perfectly righteous man and a wisdom that's not from us, but from God. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for the wisdom of Kohelet and the incarnate wisdom of your Son, Jesus. I thank you that you have a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in Jesus, things in heaven and things on earth. And we don't know how each little piece of our lives and history fits into that plan, but we know it fits. We know that there is a wisdom that we don't see fully yet, but it's there, and so we trust you. And I thank you that we have a righteousness that's not our own, but comes to us through faith in Jesus. And so we don't have to strive. We can simply believe in him, trust him day by day by day. So, Father, set us free from hyper, super, duper, uptight spirituality. Set us free from anxiety. Set us free from striving, and let us love and trust your Son. If any of my friends here have not trusted him, I pray they would see how wonderfully liberating his grace is. I pray they would see how wonderfully wise your plan is. I pray they would trust him. We ask it in Jesus' name and by the Spirit. Amen.